Welcome to Shiver Audiobooks. We're glad you're here. Before we descend into the shadows of this new thriller, take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support keeps the stories coming. In a town where the past is buried deep, one man discovers that some secrets are more valuable than gold and twice as deadly. Settle in and enjoy Stolen Fortune.
Chapter 1. The Silence of Blackwood Creek. Thomas Williams was a man who had mastered the art of disappearing while standing perfectly still. At 42, his life had become a series of subtractions. A high-stress career in forensic accounting that had ended in a quiet, clinical burnout. A marriage that had dissolved into polite, hollow indifference. And a city apartment that had begun to feel like a high-rise coffin. He was lean, with a face that looked like it had been sketched in charcoal. All sharp angles, weary shadows, and a mouth that had forgotten the muscle memory of a smile. When the opportunity to buy the Reynolds estate on the outskirts of Blackwood Creek arose, he didn't hesitate. He bought the property sight unseen, a move his former colleagues called a midlife crisis, and his ex-wife called typical avoidance. To Thomas, it was simply the only logical move left on the board. He needed a place where the noise of other people's lives couldn't reach him. The estate sat at the end of a long, unpaved driveway that wound through a dense thicket of unkempt pines. The house itself was a 3-story Victorian monstrosity, draped in ivy that looked more like a strangling vine than a decoration. Its gray paint was peeling like sunburnt skin, and the wraparound porch sagged in the center, giving the entire structure the appearance of a tired giant leaning into the hill. The town of Blackwood Creek was a study in atmospheric stillness. It was a bedroom community, though it felt more like a town that had fallen into a permanent coma. It was the kind of place where the air always felt 5 degrees cooler than the surrounding county, and where the residents didn't just grow old. They became part of the local scenery, as fixed and immutable as the granite statues in the town square. The social hierarchy was a rigid, invisible architecture governed by names that had been carved into the town's history since the mid-19th century. Chief among them were the Sterlings. Their name was everywhere. The Sterling Memorial Library, the Sterling Pediatric Wing, the Sterling Timber Mills. They were the sun around which the town orbited, distant, powerful, and seemingly essential to Blackwood Creek's continued survival. Thomas spent his first few weeks in the house in a state of rhythmic, meditative labor. He enjoyed the manual work. It was a relief from the digital labyrinths he had navigated for years. He stripped layers of floral wallpaper that had been applied during the Nixon administration and sanded down floorboards that groaned under his weight like a living thing. He liked the house's groans. They were predictable, honest sounds. However, the isolation wasn't as absolute as he had hoped. He began to feel the weight of the town's gaze. It wasn't overt, but it was there. When he went to the local hardware store, the conversation would hit a sudden, jagged wall of silence the moment he crossed the threshold. The clerk would take his money with a gloved hand, eyes never rising above Thomas's chin. Then there were the visual anomalies. On more than one occasion, Thomas would look out from his second-story window at dusk and see a black sedan idling at the very edge of his property line. It never moved, never flickered its lights. It would simply sit there, a dark stain against the green of the pines, and then vanish the moment he stepped onto the porch to investigate. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee, he watched the fog roll in from the creek. It was a thick, spectral white that swallowed the trees and muted the sounds of the night. He felt a strange, cold peace, a sense that he was finally in a place that matched his internal landscape. But the peace was a thin veneer. He began to find small signs that his sanctuary had been visited before him. A cigarette, but of a brand no longer sold in the state, tucked into a corner of the attic. A faint, lingering scent of expensive cologne in a closet that should have smelled only of mothballs and cedar. Thomas wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but 20 years of forensic auditing had taught him that patterns were never accidental. Someone was interested in this house. Someone was waiting for him to do more than just paint the walls. He realized that Blackwood Creek didn't just value privacy. It was obsessed with it. And as he stared into the dense, foggy woods surrounding his home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just bought a house. He had bought a front-row seat to a secret that had been waiting for him to arrive. Chapter 2. The Ironbound Secret. The cellar of the Reynolds estate was a subterranean world of its own, a cavernous space where the air was thick with the scent of damp slate and the metallic tang of old earth. It felt older than the Victorian structure above it, as if the house had been built over a wound in the ground that refused to heal. Thomas had spent the last 3 days mapping the source of a persistent moisture that had begun to rot the floor joists. Equipped with a heavy-duty headlamp and a 15-pound sledgehammer, he had finally traced the leak to the southeast corner, where the foundation met the rising slope of the hill. The stones here were larger, roughly hewn granite blocks that looked like they had been laid by hand in a different century. Thomas began the grueling work of chipping away at the crumbling mortar, his muscles burning with a familiar, honest ache. It was on his 4th hour of labor that the rhythm of the work shifted. He swung the hammer at a seemingly solid section of the wall, but instead of the dull, bone-jarring thud of stone, the basement erupted with a sharp, hollow metallic ring. The sound echoed off the low cedar beams, startling a nest of spiders in the rafters. Thomas froze, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and adjusted his headlamp. He struck the spot again, lighter this time. Clang! It was the sound of iron meeting steel. Driven by a sudden, electric surge of curiosity, Thomas dropped the hammer and grabbed a crowbar. He began to pry at the surrounding stones, which gave way with surprising ease, as if they had been designed to be removed. Behind a deceptive skin of mortar and fake brick, he revealed a hidden alcove. Tucked inside, resting on a bed of dry silt, was a heavy, iron-bound footlocker. It was a grim, industrial-looking object, about 3 feet long and pitted with deep orange rust. The corners were reinforced with blackened steel, and the lock was a massive, antiquated piece of machinery that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. Thomas hauled the chest into the center of the cellar, the weight of it straining his back. It felt as though he were dragging a piece of the past out of its grave. The lock refused to yield to a key, so Thomas spent the next 2 hours with a hacksaw, the rhythmic shriek of metal on metal filling the dark space. When the final shackle finally snapped, the sound was as loud as a gunshot. He took a breath, gripped the lid, and heaved it upward. It opened with a mournful, rusted scream. He had half expected gold coins or perhaps a stash of old currency, the kind of stolen fortune found in childhood stories. But as the lid fell back against the stone floor, Thomas found himself staring at something far more volatile. The chest was filled to the brim with thousands of pages of onion-skin paper, leather-bound ledgers, and black and white photographs preserved in wax-sealed envelopes. Thomas reached in and pulled a single ledger from the top. The spine was cracked, and the dates on the first page read, 1954 to 1961. As a forensic accountant, Thomas's brain didn't just see paper. It saw data. It saw patterns. Within minutes of scanning the entries, the peace of Blackwood Creek evaporated. This was a meticulous archive of human ruin. The ledgers were a masterclass in organized extortion. There were lists of state senators, regional judges, and local business leaders, men who had built the very foundations of the county. Beside each name was a leverage point, an illicit affair caught on film, a record of a secret gambling debt, or evidence of a bribe taken during the construction of the Blackwood Dam. The name that appeared most frequently, written in a cold, precise hand, was Sterling. The Sterling family hadn't just built Blackwood Creek. They had hijacked it. This box was the record of how they had used fear to gather their wealth. Every plot of land they owned, every timber mill they had acquired, was the result of a consultation fee, or a gift given in exchange for silence. The documents proved that the Sterlings had blackmailed an entire generation of leaders into handing over the keys to the kingdom. Thomas felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. He realized that the Sterling fortune, the hospitals, the libraries, the power, wasn't built on timber. It was built on the broken spines of men who couldn't afford to be exposed. A floorboard creaked above him. The sound was faint, but in the absolute silence of the house, it was unmistakable. Someone was in the kitchen, directly over his head. Thomas extinguished his headlamp instantly, plunging the cellar into a thick, suffocating blackness. He stayed perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He listened. The house groaned, but then came another sound, the slow, deliberate tread of heavy shoes moving toward the cellar door. He retreated to the far corner of the basement, his hand blindly finding the handle of the sledgehammer. Through the small, grime-streaked window at ground level, the moonlight was suddenly obscured. A pair of polished black shoes stood perfectly still on the wet grass just inches from the glass. Thomas realized then that his sanctuary was a cage. The house had been abandoned for decades, but the secret hadn't been forgotten. The Sterling family wasn't just a part of Blackwood Creek's history. They were its jailers, and he had just found the keys to the cells. He reached into the chest, grabbed the most damning ledger, labeled the Sterling Protocol, and tucked it firmly under his arm. He couldn't stay here. If they knew he had found it, he wouldn't live to see the sunrise. The forensic accountant was gone. The hunter had been born. Chapter 3. The Newsroom and the Night Shift Shadow. The drive from the Reynolds estate into the heart of Blackwood Creek was a gauntlet of shadows. Thomas kept his eyes glued to the rearview mirror, his knuckles white against the steering wheel of his old Volvo. Every pair of headlights that appeared in the distance felt like a predator's gaze. He didn't return to the main road. Instead, he navigated the winding back streets, his mind racing through the names he had glimpsed in the Sterling Protocol. He was an expert at following money trails, but this was a trail of blood and broken lives. He arrived at the Blackwood Gazette building, a weathered limestone structure tucked between a shuttered theater and a hardware store, just as the town's clock tower chimed midnight. The building was one of the few things in town the Sterlings didn't officially own, though their influence usually ensured the headlines were favorable. The newsroom was a cavern of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of stale coffee and ink. Emily Porter was exactly where the local rumors said she'd be, hunched over a desk cluttered with court transcripts and half-empty energy drinks. She was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps in her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that didn't just look at him. Z dissected him. "We're closed, mister," she said without looking up from her screen. "Whatever your grievance is, file it with the ombudsman on Monday morning." "I don't have a grievance," Thomas said, his voice raspy from the cellar dust. He stepped into the pool of light from her desk lamp and placed the black ledger, the Sterling Protocol, directly onto her keyboard. "I have the DNA of this town's aristocracy, and I think it's rotten." Emily paused. She looked at the rusted, iron-stained edges of the notebook, then up at Thomas. She saw the grime on his clothes and the raw, desperate look in his eyes. Slowly, she opened the cover. As she began to flip through the pages, her expression shifted from weary skepticism to a pale, focused intensity. She saw the photographs of Judge Higgins at the Blackwood Inn. She saw the bank records of Senator Reynolds's private donations. She saw the meticulous handwriting of a man who had treated human lives like chess pieces. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the old air conditioner. "The Reynolds estate," Thomas replied. "The Sterlings didn't just build this town, Emily. They blackmailed it into existence. This isn't just history. This is the foundation of every power structure in Blackwood Creek." Emily looked up, her grip on the notebook tightening. "Do you have any idea what you're holding?" Julian Sterling, the grandson of the man who wrote this, is currently the lead candidate for the governor's seat. If this goes public, it won't just ruin a family. It will bring down the entire state government. "That's the point," Thomas said. But the conversation was cut short by a dull thump from the lobby below. Then the building's fire alarm began to wail, a piercing, rhythmic scream that made thought impossible. "We have to go," Emily said, her instincts kicking in. She shoved her laptop into her bag and grabbed the ledger. "The night security guard is on the Sterling payroll. If that alarm is going off, it's not a fire, it's a signal." They bolted for the service stairs just as the heavy thud of boots echoed in the stairwell below them. They didn't go down, they went up, crossing the roof of the adjacent theater and sliding down a fire escape into a narrow, trash-strewn alley. As they reached Thomas's car, a dark SUV with tinted windows roared around the corner, its engine a low, predatory growl. Thomas shoved Emily into the passenger seat and floored it, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. He drove with a desperation he hadn't known he possessed, weaving through the industrial district near the creek where the fog was thickest. He finally pulled into a darkened lumber yard, killed the lights, and waited. They sat in the dark car, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. Emily looked at Thomas, her fear slowly being replaced by a fierce, journalistic fire. "They tried to kill us," she said, her voice trembling but certain. "Over 60-year-old papers." "Because those papers aren't just history," Thomas said, looking at his bruised hands. "They're leverage. And if they're still willing to kill for them, it means the Sterlings are still using the same playbooks today." Emily opened her bag and looked at the ledger. "My grandfather was one of the men in here," she said quietly. "A judge who retired suddenly in '66. They said it was his health. This book says it was a photograph taken at a motel in the city. She looked at Thomas, her eyes wet with a mix of rage and resolve. They've been holding this town hostage for 3 generations. It ends with us. Thomas nodded. He had bought a house to find silence, but he had found a war instead. And looking at Emily, he knew he wasn't fighting it alone. Chapter 4: The Ghost in the Machine. The fog over Blackwood Creek didn't just hide shapes. It muffled the world, turning the industrial district into a graveyard of rusted machinery and skeletal cranes. Inside the cramped cabin of the Volvo, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool and adrenaline. Thomas watched the entrance of the lumber yard through the rearview mirror, his hand still hovering over the ignition. "We can't go back to your apartment," Thomas said, his voice low. "And my house is compromised. If they have the security guard at the Gazette, they have the police too." Emily didn't look up from her laptop. The blue light of the screen cast sharp, ghostly shadows across her face. "I have a place. A cabin my family owns on the northern edge of the creek. It's registered under my mother's maiden name. Even the Sterlings don't have eyes everywhere." They drove in silence, taking the long way around the town's perimeter, avoiding the main arteries where the night shift shadows were likely patrolling. By the time they reached the cabin, a modest A-frame tucked behind a wall of weeping willows, the sky was beginning to bruise with the first hints of a cold, gray dawn. Inside, Emily didn't waste time. She cleared a space on a heavy oak table, spreading out the documents Thomas had rescued from the cellar next to her laptop. "You said you were a forensic accountant," Emily said, her fingers flying across the keys. "I need that brain of yours. The Sterling Protocol shows us how they started. But empires don't survive on 60-year-old secrets alone. They evolve." Thomas sat down, the weight of his exhaustion temporarily set aside by the familiar lure of a data set. He began to cross-reference the names from the 1960s ledger with modern public records. "Look at this," he pointed to a name in the old book, Arthur Penhaligon. City architect, 1964. He was blackmailed over a kickback scheme for the Blackwood Dam. He died in '82, but his son, Marcus, is currently the head of the zoning commission. Emily pulled up Marcus Penhaligon's financial disclosures. Nothing out of the ordinary. Standard salary, modest home. "Check the shell companies," Thomas countered. Accountants like the Sterling's old man didn't just hide money, they created systems. Look for recurring payments to offshore entities that match the consultation fee codes in the ledger. It took 3 hours of deep diving into the digital dark web of Blackwood Creek's bureaucracy. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, the pattern emerged. It was a ghost in the machine, a hidden layer of transactions buried within the town's modern infrastructure. "My God," Emily whispered, leaning back. "It's still happening. The codes are exactly the same. Protocol 7B. In 1962, it was for a crooked judge. Today, it's a monthly payment from the Blackwood Development Group to a private account in the Cayman Islands. The account belongs to the current mayor. It's a legacy of extortion," Thomas said, his eyes scanning the digital trail. "The Sterlings didn't just inherit the money, they inherited the leverage. They're still holding the descendants of their original victims hostage. If your father was a criminal, you pay the Sterlings to keep his memory clean. If you want to get ahead, you give them a piece of your soul." The discovery was interrupted by a sharp, electronic chirp. Emily's laptop screen flickered. A window popped up, showing a live feed from a camera she didn't recognize. It was a high-angle shot of the cabin's driveway. A black sedan was slowly rolling toward the willow trees. "They traced the IP," Emily gasped, her face turning pale. "I thought I was using a VPN." "They didn't trace the IP," Thomas said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "They traced the ledger. Look at the binding." He flipped the black notebook over. Tucked into the deep groove of the spine was a microscopic GPS transponder, a piece of modern surveillance tech hidden inside a 60-year-old relic. The kist wasn't just a hiding place, Thomas realized, his heart skipping. It was bait, or a trap. They've known exactly where we've been since I pulled it out of that wall. Outside, the car doors clicked open. The sound of footsteps on the gravel was crisp in the morning air. "Out the back," Thomas commanded, grabbing the laptop. "We can't outrun them in the car anymore. We have to go into the woods." As they scrambled through the rear window, the front door of the cabin was kicked inward with a violent crash. Thomas didn't look back. He took Emily's hand, and they disappeared into the dense, fog-heavy forest of Blackwood Creek, moving from the world of digital secrets into a raw, primitive fight for survival. Chapter 5: The Willow's Breath. The forest behind the cabin was a tangled cathedral of ancient willow and choking hemlock. The ground was a treacherous carpet of rotted leaves and slick moss that threatened to twist an ankle with every frantic step. Thomas led the way, his forensic accountant's mind, usually reserved for spreadsheets, now calculating angles of sight and the density of the brush. Behind them, the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a beacon for the men who moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of wolves. "Stay low," Thomas hissed, pulling Emily behind the massive, flared trunk of a willow tree. The air here was thick and stagnant, smelling of stagnant water and old growth. "They have the tech, but we have the shadows. They won't want to fire unless they have a clear shot. Sound travels too far over the creek." Emily was breathing in sharp, ragged gasps, her hands white-knuckled around her laptop bag. "They're professionals, Thomas. The way they moved, they weren't just hired muscle. Those were the Sterling's cleaners." "Then we stopped being prey," Thomas replied, his slate-gray eyes hardening. "We're going toward the old Blackwood mill. It's a maze of rusted iron and deep water. If we can get there, we can lose them in the echoes." As they broke into a low run, the first shot rang out, a suppressed phut that sent a spray of bark flying inches from Thomas's ear. They didn't scream. They didn't have the breath for it. They dived into a ravine, sliding down a muddy slope that deposited them at the edge of the creek itself. The water was black and sluggish, swirling around the rotted pilings of a long-forgotten bridge. The invisible hunter. Thomas realized they were being herded. The cleaners weren't just chasing them. They were flanking them, driving them toward the open marshes where there was nowhere to hide. He stopped Emily, his hand firm on her shoulder. "Wait," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" A low, persistent hum was vibrating through the mist. A drone. High-end, equipped with thermal imaging. The willow canopy was their only protection, but it was thinning. "We have to go into the water," Thomas said. "It's freezing, Thomas. We'll get hypothermia in minutes. Better than a bullet. If we stay under the overhang of the bank, the thermal won't pick up our heat against the cold water." We moved toward the mill's outflow pipe. They slipped into the creek. The cold was a physical blow, a sudden, crushing weight that robbed the air from their lungs. Thomas guided Emily under the muddy lip of the bank, their bodies submerged to the neck, hidden by the weeping branches of the willows that touched the water's surface. Above them, the footsteps of the cleaners crunched on the gravelly bank. Thomas could see the beam of a high-powered flashlight cutting through the fog, sweeping over the water like a searchlight. He held his breath, his arm anchored around Emily, feeling her tremble violently against him. "Target lost." A voice crackled from a radio mere feet above them. The voice was cold, devoid of any human emotion. "The thermal is picking up too much ground clutter from the marsh gas. Expanding the perimeter to the mill." The iron labyrinth. They waited until the footsteps receded before clawing their way out of the muck. They were shivering, their skin a ghostly blue, but the adrenaline kept them moving. The Blackwood mill loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette of broken glass and corrugated steel. Once inside, the world turned into a nightmare of shadows and echoes. The mill was a cathedral of industrial decay. Giant gears, rusted to a permanent standstill, hung over their heads like executioners' blades. "Emily, the laptop," Thomas whispered as they crouched behind a massive boiler. "If they're using the GPS in the ledger, they're also tracking any outgoing pings from your hardware. Can you set up a localized loop? A digital ghost?" Emily's fingers were stiff with cold, but her resolve was unbroken. "I can ghost the MAC address. I'll make it look like we're moving toward the highway while we're actually hunkered down here. But it'll only buy us 10 minutes before they realize the signal is artificial." 10 minutes is all we need to find the one thing the Sterlings are afraid of," Thomas said. He pulled a crumpled map from the back of the black ledger. It wasn't a map of the town, but a blueprint of the mill. There was a notation in the margin, written in the same precise 1960s hand. "The vault. Level B. Where the shadows are kept." This isn't just a mill, Thomas realized, his eyes narrowing. It was the Sterling's central filing cabinet. Before the digital age, this is where they kept the physical evidence. The stolen fortune in my basement was just the index. The actual collateral, the films, the original recordings, is still here. They descended a rusted spiral staircase into the bowels of the building. The air grew colder, smelling of grease and ancient paper. At the end of a long, dripping corridor, they found it, a heavy steel door with a rotary lock. Thomas knelt, his fingers tracing the cold metal. Emily, if we open this, there's no going back. This is the heart of the Sterling Empire. Once we see what's inside, they will never stop hunting us. Emily looked at the dark corridor behind them, then back at Thomas. They already haven't stopped. Open it. As Thomas began to manipulate the lock, a distant metallic clang echoed from the floors above. The cleaners had entered the mill. The 10 minutes were up. The hunt had moved into the iron labyrinth, and the secrets of Blackwood Creek were finally ready to be unmasked. Chapter 6: The Collateral. The steel door didn't groan. It gave way with a heavy, pressurized hiss, as if the air inside had been trapped since the Kennedy administration. Thomas and Emily slipped into the darkness, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. Thomas fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp, dusty path through the gloom. This wasn't a basement. It was a vault. Rows of industrial steel shelving stretched into the darkness, lined with thousands of canisters of 16mm film, reel-to-reel audio tapes, and manila folders thick with original documents. This was the Sterling's insurance policy, the physical weight of their leverage. While the ledger Thomas found in the cellar was the map, this room was the treasure. "It's a library of sins," Emily whispered, her voice echoing off the reinforced concrete walls. She reached out, touching a canister labeled Senator J. Vance Blue Room, 1963. "If we can get just a fraction of this out, the Sterling name won't just be mud. It will be a curse." Thomas wasn't looking at the shelves. He was looking at a desk in the center of the room. On it sat a modern, high-speed document scanner and a satellite uplink terminal. The equipment was sleek, black, and very much active. A small green light pulsed rhythmically on the side of the console. "They haven't just been keeping this here," Thomas realized, his voice tightening. "They've been digitizing it. They're moving the stolen fortune into the 21st century. This is why the cleaners are so desperate. They aren't just protecting a secret, they're protecting a transition." A sudden, violent vibration rattled the vault door. Clang! Clang! Someone was hitting the steel with a sledgehammer. The cleaners had followed the sound of the door's hiss. They were trapped. "Thomas, the door won't hold forever," Emily said, her voice rising in panic. She scrambled to the scanner, her fingers flying across the controls. "If I can sync this terminal with my laptop, I can bypass their encryption and start a mass upload to a secure cloud server. But it's going to take time. A lot of it." "How much time?" 20 minutes for the core files. 30 if we want the high-res film scans." Thomas looked at the door. The steel was already beginning to buckle inward. He looked back at the vault. There was no other exit. He was a man of numbers, and the math here was simple. They had 10 minutes of door integrity and 30 minutes of upload time. The equation didn't balance. "Start the upload," Thomas commanded. He turned to a rack of fire extinguishers near the entrance and grabbed a heavy crowbar leaning against the wall. "What are you doing?" "Accounting," Thomas said, a grim, cold smile touching his lips. "I'm going to balance the books." The door didn't shatter. It was blown off its hinges. A flashbang grenade skittered across the concrete floor. Crack! The world turned into a white-hot scream of light and sound. Thomas, expecting the tactic, had ducked behind a heavy filing cabinet. As the first cleaner stepped through the smoke, a man in a tactical vest with a suppressed submachine gun. Thomas didn't use a gun. He used the environment. He pulled a lever on the side of a massive, mobile shelving unit. Thousands of pounds of steel and lead-weighted film canisters groaned as they slid forward, catching the cleaner off guard. The man was pinned against the concrete wall by the sheer weight of the Sterling legacy. His weapon clattered to the floor. The second cleaner, a larger man with a scarred throat, stepped over his comrade. He didn't fire immediately. He saw Emily at the terminal, the progress bar on the screen at 42%. "Stop the upload, girl," the man rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "You have no idea what you're burning down. You think the Sterlings are the only ones with secrets in this room? Look at the folders. Half the heroes of your town are in here. If this goes out, Blackwood Creek ceases to exist." "Then let it burn," Emily shouted, her hand hovering over the confirm key. "Better to live in the ashes of the truth than in a mansion built on lies." The man raised his weapon, but Thomas was already moving. He swung the heavy crowbar with every ounce of frustration and rage he had accumulated over his 42 years. The blow caught the man's wrist, the gun firing a wild burst into the ceiling before falling into the dark. They surged into a brutal, desperate struggle in the center of the vault. Thomas was smaller, But he was fighting for more than just his life. He was fighting for the justice of the thousands of names in those files. The progress bar hit 88%. The scarred man managed to pin Thomas to the floor, his hands closing around Thomas's throat. "It's over, Williams," he hissed. "The Sterlings always win. It's the way of the world." Thomas gasped for air, his vision tunneling. He looked toward Emily. She had a choice. She could save him, or she could finish the upload. If she stopped to help, the cleaner's backup would arrive and erase the data. "Finish it," Thomas choked out. Emily looked at Thomas, her eyes brimming with tears. She looked at the screen. 95%. 96%. With a scream of pure defiance, Emily didn't reach for a weapon. She reached for the satellite terminal and smashed it with a heavy film canister. But only after the screen flashed, "Upload complete." The sudden loss of the signal caused the vault's emergency systems to trigger. A fire suppression gas, halon, began to hiss from the ceiling vents. In seconds, the oxygen in the room would be replaced. The scarred man, realizing he was about to suffocate, released Thomas and scrambled toward the door. Thomas lay on the floor, gasping, as Emily dragged him toward the small ventilation duct she had spotted earlier. "We got it," she sobbed, pulling him into the narrow, cramped space just as the vault turned into a silent, breathless tomb behind them. "It's out. It's all out." They crawled through the dark, the sounds of the Sterling Empire crumbling around them. The stolen fortune was no longer a secret. It was a wildfire. Chapter 7: The Fallout. The sun rose over Blackwood Creek, not with a gentle glow, but with the harsh, cold clarity of a surgical lamp. By 6 a.m., the digital wildfire Emily had ignited was consuming the national airwaves. The Sterling leaks were everywhere. From the front pages of major newspapers to every social media feed in the country, the world was waking up to the realization that an entire American dynasty was built on 60 years of systematic ruin. Thomas and Emily watched the world break from a burner phone in a roadside diner 30 miles outside of town. The news anchors were shell-shocked. They spoke of the ledger of leverage and showed grainy, digitized clips of the 1963 motel films. The names being dropped, former governors, sitting judges, titans of industry, sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. "We did it," Emily whispered, her hands trembling as she held a cup of black coffee. Her face was smudged with soot and her eyes were bloodshot, but there was a fierce light in them. "The secrets are out. There's no putting the lid back on this box." Thomas, however, wasn't celebrating. He sat with his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on the diner's entrance. "It's not over, Emily. The Sterlings are like cornered wolves now. When a family like that realizes they've lost their reputation, they stop playing by the rules of society entirely. They go into scorched earth mode." His prediction came true within the hour. The news feed on the phone flickered with a breaking news alert. Tragedy in Blackwood Creek. A massive gas explosion has leveled the historic Reynolds estate. Authorities are searching the rubble for the new owner, Thomas Williams, who is a person of interest in a multi-state fraud investigation. Thomas stared at the screen. They hadn't just blown up his house. They were rewriting his history. In the eyes of the law, he was no longer a whistleblower. He was a criminal on the run who had destroyed his own home to hide his tracks. "They're erasing us," Emily said, her voice dropping an octave. "They're turning the narrative against us before we can even testify." "They're doing more than that," Thomas said, pointing to the television above the counter. A local news crawl announced that Julian Sterling had declared a state of emergency in the county, citing digital terrorism and civil unrest. He had activated his private security forces, the same cleaners who had hunted them in the mill, to assist the local police. In reality, he had turned Blackwood Creek into a private fortress. No one was getting in, and more importantly, no one was getting out with their lives. "We can't just hide," Thomas said, standing up. "The cloud upload is a start, but we need the original Sterling Protocol ledger. I hid it in the one place they'll never look because they think they already destroyed it." "Where?" Emily asked. "The hollow base of the old founder's statue in the town square. I tucked it there before we went to the Gazette. It's the physical proof that ties the digital files to Julian's grandfather's own handwriting. Without that physical link, their lawyers will argue the digital files were faked or AI generated." "You want to go back into Blackwood Creek?" Emily looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "It's a war zone, Thomas. Every cop and every hired gun is looking for us." "It's the only way to finish this," Thomas replied. "We have the truth, but we need the evidence to make it stick. We go back, we get the ledger, and we hand it over to the federal agents who are currently waiting at the county line. They didn't use the car. They used the old timber trails, moving through the woods like ghosts. As they reached the ridge overlooking the town, they saw the reality of Julian Sterling's desperation. Smoke rose from several buildings. Checkpoints were stationed at every intersection. The town was suffocating under the weight of its own secrets. As they crept toward the town square under the cover of a gathering storm, Thomas saw him, Julian Sterling himself. He was standing on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by men in tactical gear. He didn't look like a politician. He looked like a warlord watching his world burn. "Thomas," Emily whispered, pointing toward the square. "There's a sniper on the roof of the library. They're expecting us." Thomas looked at the statue in the center of the square, the iron likeness of the first Sterling patriarch. Somewhere in its base lay the key to destroying the man on the steps. "I'll draw them off," Thomas said, his voice cold and certain. "You're faster. When the shooting starts, you get to the statue, grab the ledger, and run for the creek. Don't look back for me. Just get that book to the feds." "No, Thomas. It's the math, Emily," he interrupted, his slate-gray eyes locking onto hers. "One of us has to survive to tell the story, and you're the one who knows how to write it." Before she could argue, Thomas stepped out from behind the trees and into the line of sight of the library roof. He didn't run. He walked calmly toward the center of the square, a man with nothing left to lose and a debt that was finally due. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence of Blackwood Creek, and the final 24 hours of the Sterling dynasty began. Chapter 8: The Iron Witness. The bullet struck the pavement inches from Thomas's boots, sending a spray of stone and sparks into the air. He didn't flinch. He continued walking toward the center of the square, his eyes fixed on Julian Sterling. On the steps of City Hall, the patriarch of the modern Sterling Empire watched Thomas's approach with a mask of aristocratic calm that was beginning to crack at the edges. "Stop right there, Williams," a voice boomed over a megaphone. It was the chief of police, standing just behind Julian, but the way the chief glanced at Julian for approval told the real story. The law in Blackwood Creek was wearing a Sterling collar. Thomas stopped 10 feet from the statue of the first Sterling. "The world is watching, Julian," Thomas shouted, his voice echoing off the brick facades of the square. "The servers are full. The files are public. You can't kill 1,000,000 downloads." Julian stepped forward, his voice amplified by the podium's microphone. "Digital forgeries, Thomas. A desperate attempt by a failing man to extort a noble family. The people of this town know who we are. They know what we've built. They know what you stole," Thomas countered. Behind the pedestal of the statue, he saw a flicker of movement. Emily. She was in position, hidden by the heavy iron base of the monument. She just needed a distraction. "You want the original?" Thomas reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a bundle wrapped in plastic. From a distance, it looked exactly like the Black Ledger. "I have the physical proof right here. The ink that matches your grandfather's DNA. The original photos that haven't been touched by a computer. Come and get it." The greed and fear in Julian's eyes were unmistakable. He gestured to 2 of his tactical cleaners. "Bring me that package. And if he resists, end it." As the men moved toward Thomas, the sky finally broke. A torrential downpour turned the square into a gray blur of wind and water. This was the moment. Thomas didn't hand over the package. Instead, he turned and sprinted toward the library, shouting at the top of his lungs. The snipers shifted their focus. The cleaners gave chase. The square erupted into a chaos of shouting and gunfire. Under the cover of the noise and the rain, Emily reached into the hollow compartment at the base of the statue. Her fingers brushed against the cold, leather spine of the actual ledger. She pulled it out, tucked it against her chest, and vanished into the shadows of the alleyway behind the square. Thomas didn't make it to the library. A black SUV skidded across the wet bricks, blocking his path. He was tackled from behind, his face slammed into the cold stone. As he was dragged back toward the City Hall steps, he saw the plastic-wrapped bundle he had used as bait being ripped open. It contained nothing but a stack of old wallpaper samples from his house. Julian Sterling looked down at the paper, his face contorting with a primal, ugly rage. He walked down the steps and stood over Thomas. "Where is it?" Julian hissed. Thomas spat a mouthful of blood onto the pavement. "It's already gone, Julian. You're chasing a ghost. Check the perimeter." Julian screamed at his men. "Find the girl. She's the one with the book. But then the unexpected happened. The chief of police, who had been standing loyally behind Julian, stepped forward. He wasn't looking at Thomas, he was looking at his phone. "Julian," the chief said, his voice trembling. "The Federal Bureau, they just released a statement. They've authenticated the digital signatures from the upload. They've issued warrants. Not just for you. For me. For everyone in this square." Julian turned on him. "I paid you. I bought your father's house. I paid for your daughter's surgery. You do what I say." "The money is gone, Julian," the chief said, his face pale. "The feds froze the Sterling accounts 10 minutes ago. We're standing on a sinking ship." In that moment of hesitation, Thomas saw his opening. He drove his elbow into the gut of the man holding him and lunged for the chief's holstered sidearm. He didn't want to kill, he wanted the leverage. But Julian was faster. He pulled a small, silver pistol from his suit jacket, a refined weapon for a refined monster, and pointed it directly at Thomas's head. "If I go down," Julian whispered, "I'm taking the man who broke my world with me." The square went silent, save for the roar of the rain. Thomas looked into Julian's eyes and saw the end of a dynasty. He wasn't afraid. He had accounted for everything. "Look up, Julian," Thomas said calmly. Through the rain, the rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of heavy rotors began to drown out the storm. For black helicopters, marked with federal insignias, descended over the square like vengeful spirits. Searchlights bathed the scene in a blinding, artificial noon. Emily Porter stepped out from the mouth of the alley, flanked by 2 men in windbreakers marked FBI. She held the black ledger high in the air, the iron witness to 60 years of crime. Julian Sterling looked at the sky, then at the girl, then at the man at his feet. The pistol in his hand wavered. The stolen fortune was finally being repossessed by the truth. Chapter 9: The Trial of the Century. The arrest of Julian Sterling was not the end. It was the beginning of a legal siege. Within 48 hours, the most expensive legal team in the country had descended upon the state capitol. They didn't just defend their client. They attacked the very fabric of the evidence. They called the digital uploads manipulated deepfakes and the physical ledger a fraudulent plant by a disgruntled squatter. Thomas Williams, now the star witness for the prosecution, found himself moved from the shadows of Blackwood Creek to a high-security federal safe house. He was no longer a man seeking silence. He was the most protected and most hunted man in the nation. The trial took place in a reinforced courtroom, shielded against electronic interference and guarded by U.S. Marshals. Julian Sterling sat at the defense table, stripped of his tactical gear and back in his bespoke Italian suits. He looked not like a warlord, but like a victim of a technological witch hunt. Emily Porter sat in the gallery, her laptop replaced by a reporter's notebook. She had become the voice of the trial, her daily columns detailing the Sterlings' crimes reaching millions. But the tension in the room was brittle. The Sterlings still had shadows, loyalists in high places who hadn't been swept up in the initial warrants. "The prosecution calls Thomas Williams to the stand," the district attorney announced. Thomas walked to the stand, his gaze locking with Julian's. The patriarch didn't flinch. He offered a thin, shark-like smile. It was the smile of a man who knew a secret the rest of the room hadn't learned yet. As Thomas began to testify, detailing the forensic trail from the iron-bound chest to the Caymans, a subtle shift occurred in the gallery. A man in a dark suit, someone Thomas didn't recognize from the Sterling inner circle, stood up and walked toward the exit. Seconds later, the lights in the courtroom flickered and died. The emergency generators kicked in, bathing the room in an eerie red hum. "Stay seated," the judge shouted, but the silence was shattered by a muffled explosion from the floor below. "They're not here to rescue him," Emily shouted over the din. "They're here to sanitize the record." In the chaos, the defense's lead counsel didn't reach for a law book. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a localized EMP device, a small, high-tech cylinder. He activated it, and every digital record in the courtroom, including the authenticated copies of the stolen fortune on the prosecution's laptops, was instantly wiped into static. The shadows had calculated perfectly. They had destroyed the digital evidence in the room. They had created a diversion to extract Julian. But they had forgotten about the man who lived in the world of physical ledgers. As a hired assassin disguised as a court officer lunged toward the witness stand with a silenced pistol, Thomas didn't dive for cover. He reached into the heavy, fireproof evidence box on the clerk's desk. He pulled out the original Sterling protocol, the physical ledger. "You can't delete the ink," Thomas roared. He used the heavy, iron-bound book as a shield, the first bullet embedding itself into the thick leather cover. The same cover that had protected the Sterling's secrets for 60 years. Thomas swung the book with a desperate, heavy force, catching the assassin across the temple. Emily Porter didn't just watch. She had predicted the move on the digital files. She stood up, holding a low-tech, analog film projector she had smuggled into the court under the guise of historical reference. With the digital systems down, she clicked the manual switch. On the far wall of the courtroom, a grainy, black-and-white 16mm film began to roll. It was the original footage from the vault, the one piece of Collateral Thomas had insisted they keep in analog form. It showed Julian's father and the current chief of police's predecessor shaking hands over a stack of blood money. The jury, sitting in the red glow of the emergency lights, watched the undeniable, flickering truth. You couldn't hack a film strip. You couldn't encrypt a shadow on a wall. Julian Sterling's composure finally shattered. He stood up, screaming at his lawyers, at the ghosts on the wall, and at the man on the stand who refused to die. "It's over, Julian," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The audit is complete. Your debt is called in." The marshals swarmed the room, subduing the assassins and pinning Julian to the floor. The trial of the century had turned into a brawl, but the truth remained standing. Chapter 10: Scorched Earth. The courtroom victory felt like a triumph, but in the dark heart of the Sterling Empire, it was merely a signal for the final protocol. As Julian was led away in chains, he leaned toward Thomas and whispered a single chilling phrase. "If I can't own Blackwood Creek, no one will." Thomas and Emily didn't have time to celebrate. Within the hour, reports began to flood in from the north. The Sterling's remaining loyalists, a splinter cell of cleaners, who knew their lives were forfeit once the ledger's contents were fully processed, had returned to the town. They weren't there to hide anymore. They were there to burn the evidence, the witnesses, and the very ground the town stood on. By the time Thomas and Emily reached the outskirts of Blackwood Creek, the sky was orange. The Sterling timber mills, the economic heart of the town, were a towering inferno. The fire had been set with industrial accelerants, designed to be unquenchable. "They're destroying the physical archives," Emily cried, watching the black smoke choke the valley. "Everything we didn't get out of the mill, it's all going up." "It's not just the files," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on the town center. "Look at the water tower. Look at the bridge. They're cutting the town off. They want to turn Blackwood Creek into a funeral pyre." The town was in a state of primal terror. The local police force had dissolved. Half were in hiding, the other half were actively assisting the cleaners. Thomas and Emily had to navigate a landscape of barricades and broken glass. The stolen fortune had become a curse that was now consuming the innocent. The cleaners' final target was the Sterling Memorial Library. It was a cruel irony. The building was the Sterling's greatest public gift, but its basement housed the town's historical land deeds and the original municipal charters. Documents that Thomas knew contained the proof of how the Sterlings had illegally seized the valley's water rights in 1958. "If those deeds burn, the town loses its legal right to the land," Thomas explained as they crouched behind a burnt-out patrol car. "The Sterling Corporation's secondary shell companies will automatically inherit the titles through a dead man's clause in the original contracts. They'll win even from a prison cell." They reached the library just as a team of 3 cleaners prepared to toss incendiary grenades through the stained glass windows. Thomas didn't have a weapon, but he had the environment. He knew the building's layout from his weeks of obsessive research. He circled to the back, utilizing the old coal chute he had mapped out. Inside, the library was a tomb of silence and vellum. Thomas moved through the stacks, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. He found the fire suppression system, an antiquated halon setup similar to the one in the mill. "Emily, get to the archives," Thomas shouted as the first window shattered. "Get the 58 charters. I'll handle the ventilation duct." As the cleaners entered, the lead man, the same scarred mercenary from the vault, leveled his rifle. "You're a hard man to kill, Williams. But even an accountant knows when the numbers don't add up. You're out of moves." "I only need one," Thomas said. He pulled the manual release for the halon system. The gas hissed into the room, a white, suffocating mist. But Thomas had prepared. He had pulled an old emergency oxygen mask from a display case of 1950s mining gear. In the breathless silence of the gas-filled room, The cleaners collapsed, their lungs unable to find oxygen. Thomas moved among them like a ghost, disarming them with clinical precision. He wasn't a soldier. He was a man performing a final audit. Emily emerged from the basement, her arms wrapped around a heavy, fireproof case. I have them, Thomas. The original charters. The signatures are all there. They stumbled out of the building just as the roof began to groan under the heat of the nearby mill fires. Outside, the first columns of the National Guard were finally breaking through the Sterling barricades at the county line. The state of emergency was being overtaken by a higher power. Thomas stood in the middle of the street, watching the town he had come to love and hate simultaneously. The Sterlings had tried to erase the truth with fire, but the paper had survived. The scorched earth had failed to claim its prize. He looked at Emily, who was already documenting the scene, her camera flashing against the backdrop of the dying flames. She was the future. He was the man who had cleared the debts of the past. It's over, Thomas whispered. Not yet, Emily replied, looking at the fireproof case. We still have one more chapter to write. Chapter 11, The New Ledger. The fires of Blackwood Creek eventually died down, leaving behind a landscape of charred timber and a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret. It was the quiet of a fever that had finally broken. In the weeks following the scorched earth night, the town became a hive of federal activity. The Sterling name was chiseled off the library, the hospital, and the parks. The stolen fortune was liquidated by the government, the funds redirected into a massive victim restitution trust. For the first time in 60 years, the people of Blackwood Creek owned their own town. Thomas Williams did not leave. He returned to the Reynolds estate. The main house was a hollowed shell of blackened beams, but the stone foundation, and the cellar where it all began, remained intact. He set up a small living space in the restored carriage house at the back of the property. He sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset bleed over the creek. His face bore a new scar across the cheek, a permanent reminder of the vault, but the slate-gray eyes were no longer weary. They were clear. A car pulled up the gravel driveway. Emily Porter stepped out, carrying a thick envelope and 2 bottles of beer. She looked different, too, less like a frantic hunter and more like the celebrated journalist she had become. Her book, The Shadow of the Creek, was already a bestseller. I thought I might find you here, she said, handing him a bottle. I'm a man of habits, Emily, and I still have a roof to fix. You have more than that, she said, sitting on the steps beside him. She opened the envelope. The final audit came through today. With the 1958 charters you saved from the library, the court has officially nullified every land grab the Sterlings made. This estate? It doesn't just belong to you because you bought it. It belongs to you because there are no more liens, no more insurance clauses. It's finally a home. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the fireflies dance over the tall grass. There's something else, Emily said, her voice dropping. I went through the last of the digitized files from the vault. The ones we uploaded right before the EMP. Thomas tensed. What did you find? A file marked Reynolds, Final Disposition, 1969. It explains why this house was abandoned for so long. The Reynolds family didn't just go bankrupt and leave. They were the only ones who tried to fight the Sterlings back then. They were the ones who built the hidden alcove in your cellar. They weren't hiding the chest to protect the Sterlings. They were hiding it for someone like you to find. Thomas looked back at the ruins of the main house. He felt a sudden, profound connection to the people who had lived there before him. He hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. He had been the recipient of a long-delayed handoff. There was one more name in the ledger, Emily continued. A silent partner. Someone who helped the Sterlings set up the offshore accounts in the very beginning. A man named Edward Williams. Thomas froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. Williams. Your grandfather, Thomas. He wasn't a victim. He was the architect. He's the reason your family had the money that you eventually lost in the city. The irony hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had come to Blackwood Creek to escape his past, only to spend months dismantling the very empire his own blood had helped create. His burnout in the city, his loss of wealth. It was all a cosmic balancing of the scales he hadn't even known existed. Thomas didn't look angry. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had spent 42 years following trails of paper, only to find himself at the end of his own. I guess the audit is finally complete, Thomas said quietly. What will you do now? Emily asked. The town wants you to run for the new council. They need someone who knows where the bodies are buried. Thomas smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. No, I've had enough of politics and ledgers. I think I'll just finish the house. Maybe plant some trees that don't look like they're trying to strangle each other. Emily laughed and stood up, leaning over to kiss his cheek. If you ever get bored, I'm starting an investigative firm in the city. I could use a good accountant. Someone who isn't afraid of the dark. I'll keep it in mind, Thomas said. As her car disappeared down the driveway, Thomas walked back down into the cellar one last time. He stood in the spot where he had swung the sledgehammer and changed his life. He picked up a fresh piece of chalk and on the stone wall, he wrote a single word, paid. The stolen fortune was gone. The debt was settled. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Williams was exactly where he was supposed to be.
Thank you for listening to this production of Shiver Audiobooks. We hope the dark history of Blackwood Creek kept you gripped until the very last word. If the art of the Sterling family kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep digging up these bone-chilling tales. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new release. We have many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we wouldn't want you to be left in the dark. The debt has been settled, and the ledger is finally closed. Until next time, stay vigilant.